When Sandra first found her cat Missy lounging in the bathroom sink one crisp autumn morning, she thought it was just another one of her cat's peculiar habits. Cats were known for squeezing into the strangest of places, and Missy was no exception. Amused, Sandra chuckled at the sight of her fluffy tabby sprawled out with her paws draped over the edges, eyes half closed in contentment. The porcelain was cool, and Missy's fur spread out like a silky blanket, the sunlight from the window casting warm patterns across her back. Sandra pulled out her phone, snapping a few photos to send to her friends with a caption about how silly her cat could be. She thought little of it at the time, just one more quirky behavior to add to Missy's ever-growing list. But Missy's fixation on the sink didn't wane. In fact, it only seemed to grow stronger. By the second day, Sandra found Missy back in the sink, her eyes wide and unblinking, ears twitching at every sound. It was strange, but Sandra assumed it was just a phase. Yet, as the days passed, a subtle sense of unease began to creep into her thoughts. Missy had stopped following Sandra around the house, stopped coming when called, and, most alarming of all, stopped responding to the familiar crinkle of treat bags. The cat seemed to ignore everything, fixated entirely on the drain. Even at night, when Sandra would get up for a glass of water, she'd find Missy in the darkened bathroom, her green eyes glowing faintly, never leaving the sink. Sandra's concern grew into outright panic one morning when she realized Missy was nowhere to be found. She tore through the apartment, calling her name, shaking bags of treats, and checking all of her favorite hiding spots. The closet, under the bed, behind the sofa. Her heart pounded painfully. Each minute that passed a reminder that Missy could have slipped outside. The thought made her chest tight. She was about to grab her keys and search the neighborhood when a faint noise stopped her in her tracks. A soft, rhythmic scraping sound so faint it was almost imperceptible. The sound was coming from the bathroom. With a mix of dread and relief, Sandra crept down the hallway, each step slower than the last. The door was open just a crack, and she nudged it further, holding her breath. Missy was there, of course, still in the sink, eyes fixed on the drain, pupils blown wide. But it was the sound that froze Sandra to the spot. That soft, scraping noise echoed up from the pipes, a hollow and chilling sound that set every nerve in Sandra's body alight with fear. For a long moment, she simply stood there, her hand on the door frame, her mind refusing to process what she was hearing. Then, with a sudden jerky motion, she forced herself forward, crouching beside the sink, her ear inches from the drain. The sound was louder now, a wet, slithering scrape that seemed to vibrate through the porcelain. Sandra's breath caught in her throat. Rational explanations raced through her mind. A clogged pipe, a rat, even some distant echo from another apartment. But none of them felt right. The noise was too deliberate, too close. She pulled back sharply, heart hammering, and snatched Missy up despite the cat's protesting yowl. For a moment, Missy writhed, but when Sandra set her down on the floor, the cat bolted straight back to the sink, paws scrabbling to jump back in. Sandra's hand shook as she turned on the faucet, letting cold water rush down the drain, hoping to dislodge whatever was making the sound. But the noise continued, undeterred, scraping and scratching beneath the gurgling water. By nightfall, the noise had grown louder and Missy's fixation had become desperate. She refused to leave the sink, her eyes dark and wide, fur fluffed in agitation. Sandra called a plumber the next morning, her voice trembling as she described the sound. The man on the phone seemed unimpressed. Probably a clogged pipe, he assured her. They could send someone out by noon. The plumber arrived, a burly man with a tool belt and a wary expression. He listened as Sandra explained, nodding absently, and then set to work. Sandra hovered nearby, her hands twisting in her sleeves, eyes flicking nervously to the sink where Missy still sat, tail flicking. The plumber grunted as he twisted a wrench, his brow furrowing deeper with each passing minute. At one point he paused, head tilted as if listening, and his face blanched. I'm gonna need to go check the main line, he mumbled, his voice unsteady. Might be a bigger problem than I thought. Sandra watched him go, heart pounding so loud she could hardly hear anything else. He was gone for what felt like hours, each tick of the kitchen clock stretching into eternity. When he finally returned, his face was drawn and pale, eyes darting to the bathroom door with something like fear. "You might want to call the cops," he said, voice tight. "There's something in the pipes, and it's not a rat." The officers arrived quickly, their expressions grim as Sandra recounted the events. They moved through the apartment with brisk efficiency, one kneeling beside the sink to listen, another examining the walls, tapping lightly. Missy had to be shut in the bedroom, her yowls muffled and frantic. Sandra hovered anxiously, wringing her hands, her questions met with curt assurances that everything was under control. But when one officer emerged from the bathroom, face pale and eyes wide, Sandra's heart sank. "Ma'am," he began carefully, "we need you to come with us." They led her down to the basement, where the smell hit her first, damp and sour, with an undertone of something metallic. The maintenance hatch yawned open, and one by one the officers descended into the dark. Sandra hesitated, fear clawing at her throat, but one of the officers gently took her arm, guiding her forward. The ladder groaned under her weight, the chill of the concrete seeping through her slippers. The corridor at the bottom was narrow, the walls streaked with grime. They moved forward, flashlights cutting through the gloom, the beams skittering over rusted pipes and puddles of stagnant water. At the end of the corridor, a door hung ajar, the wood splintered and damp. And beyond that, a room. Barely more than a hollow in the concrete, but unmistakably lived in. A mattress lay in one corner, stained and sagging, surrounded by piles of wrappers and cans. But it was the wall that stopped Sandra cold. Photos. Dozens of them, maybe more, pinned in overlapping layers. Photos of her. Coming home from work, watering her plants, sitting on the couch, oblivious to the eyes watching her. Her knees gave out. One officer caught her arm, steadying her, his grip firm but gentle. "It's okay, ma'am," he murmured. "We've got him." They found the man hiding in a storm drain a few blocks away, disheveled, muttering, eyes wide and unseeing. Homeless, they said later. Unstable. He had slipped in through an old service tunnel, found his way into the pipes and vents, watching through grates and drains. Sandra never moved back. The landlord apologized profusely, waived the lease, tried to make amends, but Sandra packed her things, hired movers, and left without looking back. Missy seemed to sense the tension, staying close, eyes always flicking to shadows. In her new apartment, with bolts on the doors and bars on the windows, Sandra lay awake at night, every creak and groan a whisper of eyes in the dark. And in the bathroom, Missy prowled the edges of the sink, ears twitching, never quite letting her guard down.